Hello, everyone. Professor Tom Berry here. This lecture, the first one for the term, is really just about providing kind of like the background on sociology, theoretical perspectives in sociology, and then talking about this framework called the matrix of domination. And we will use the matrix model throughout the course of the term. You guys will become real familiar with it. It'll take a little while to kind of sink your teeth into it, but after a few weeks, you'll be right on track with it. And we'll clarify, provide applications by the end of the term. By midterm and by the final, you'll be writing about the matrix of domination. So it will make sense. It just takes a little while to get started. Okay, so yeah, let me share my screen, kind of walk you through some content. With these lectures, I break things down into themes. And so part of your write-up is talking about each of the different themes, providing a summary, recapture, the ideas that are presented with each of the different themes. Okay, so that's kind of the focus. All right, so I start off here with this quote from Audre Lorde. The focus of revolutionary change is never meant or never merely the oppressive situations. It's not about the situations, but the piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within each of us. And I like that quote to kind of start off this class and thinking about the model of like a democratic society is valuing equal protection, equality, equal rights, not necessarily equality of outcome, but equality in terms of treatment by institutions. Issues of equity become really important. And how that system, a system of inequality is maintained. Inequality meaning both privilege, groups that have privilege in society, as well as groups that are dominated within society itself. That situation, the degree of inequality is maintained because all of us carry parts of the oppressor within us. It doesn't matter if you're part of the majority group or a minority group. We all have parts of that. We all been socialized into this culture, into this world, and we have components of the oppressor within us. Part of the matrix of domination is trying to unlock that. It's trying to understand how systems of inequality are established, how they reinforce themselves, the place or the role that individuals play in reinforcing that. So it's just trying to provide an analytical framework in order to understand the relationship between privilege and domination, and then how do we go about making some sort of meaningful social change. So the first thing I want to kind of get into here is basically providing a framework or going over the three major sociological theories. I'm going to go through these pretty fast. If you have not had SOC212 before, I encourage you to do a little bit more investigation. So hold on one second. All right, so I had to pull up the screen here. So in week one folder, there's this article, Call Me, the Three Sociological Perspectives. I encourage you to read that. It's like 6-7 pages long, it's pretty short. And it provides a really great summary of all three theories. And I'm not just gonna hit some highlights, but I think it's important to be able to read the content and read about the three sociological theories. You're gonna get a lot out of that. So I encourage you to read that document. It'll help to make sense of sociology, as well as the different perspectives that are being offered, these three different theories. The first one is called structural functionalism. The idea that basically, this is Emil Durkheim, he kind of founded kind of contemporary 1800s, mid and late 1800s, formed sociology and sort of as an academic discipline. So he's oftentimes seen as sort of the father or the establisher of structural functionalism. Although this theory kind of goes back longer than that. But basically the idea that Durkheim made a connection between biology and the social world. So biology had already existed as a discipline, natural sciences had existed as a discipline. And so what Durkheim did in some beautiful, genius way said, okay, look, the principles of the natural world, some of the same things that are going on in the natural world are exactly what goes on in the social world. At least the ideas, the ways of thinking about biological organisms, the same ideas apply to social systems. So for example, every biological system, every environmental system, every ecological system is seeking balance and order. Some sort of way of maintaining balance and order, right? So there could be an event, a crisis, the organism responds to that crisis to protect itself, to create stability, right? Think about viruses, think about colds, flus, think about COVID, whatever it may be, is that the biological system is self-preservation. Social systems are about self-preservation. And there are mechanisms that come into play that help facilitate developing a strongly or well-organized organism, developing an organism that's responsive to change, adaptive to change. And that's kind of like, that's the idea, the model. So keep that in perspective. The idea, if you're looking at a biological system like a social system, is that society has all these different interlinking parts. Interlinking parts might be family, sports and leisure, entertainment, the government, politics, mass media, healthcare delivery, mental health care delivery. And one thing to think, one sort of way of thinking about structural functionalism is that using the framework and using the idea that Colony mentions in his sort of summary is that society is a problem-solving entity. So we develop institutions and we develop parts within the system when things are needed. Okay, so to kind of keep things somewhat kind of simple, thinking about response to COVID. Okay, so crisis happens, virus happens. It's a threat to the social order. We have institutions in place that are there that we activate and that we use, Center for Disease Control, National Institute of Health, to be able to bring information resources to the general public. Now, the question is whether or not, okay, that's one part, right? And that part, the media is one part. The Center for Disease Control is one part. COVID had an impact on the economy. The economy impacts family, right? All these things are related, right? And the government has a role in trying to regulate things, provide resources in order to ensure that the economy and people are being well taken care of or sufficiently taken care of so that the system can maintain itself. The idea is that society is built on a value consensus. So in a democratic society, right, it's representation, that we all have a voice. It's a representative democracy, not a direct democracy. So we have people that we elect to represent our values and our ideas within, within the government, whether that's local, state, or federal government. Society is built upon a general consensus, not necessarily agreement, but consensus. You could look at something like same-sex marriage and laws around same-sex marriage. The perspective that a functionalist would offer is that as values in society shifted regarding same-sex relations, the laws that prohibited same-sex marriage were no longer acceptable. People marched, people protested, people raised their voice, and through raising their voice is they were able to change the law to allow for same-sex marriage. That's kind of the idea that society is a value consensus, but that those values can change, and it's up to us, people in society, to organize to be able to change policies and practices, whatever they may be. A couple other things here are social integration. For a well-functioning system, you need to have people have a sense of community, that they're pretty well integrated within society itself, have a sense of membership, whether that's within social groups or larger sort of, regional, national, that people feel a sense of belonging and connection. And it makes sense, right? I mean, if we have tight-knit communities, not communities that we're getting strangled in as far as like we're getting suffocated because they're too tight, but this sort of balance between people feel belonging and connection, they feel a sense of responsibility to the collective, to the social group. Like that's a good thing, right? So if you feel like you're part of the community, you're valued within your community, you're integrated into the community, you're more responsible within the community. That's the kind of the logic and the idea. And then there's the idea of regulation. So when there's a violation, people violate our values, or there's a violation of values, that we regulate behavior to help ensure that order is protected and our values are maintained. So for example, somebody makes a racist comment, a sexist comment, a celebrity or someone who's in a prominent public position. The there may be regulation of that by people in communities, by general public, providing a response. And those regulations give us kind of a sense of what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, these kind of things. Anomie is sudden change, sudden dramatic change that creates instability or normlessness, as a way of defining anomie. And Durkheim kind of was writing during a time period of transitioning from kind of an agrarian society, industrial capitalism, modern kind of social world. And he saw a huge change, right? This kind of very disruptive change to this kind of contemporary social world that sort of moved to modern social world. And that created a lot of normlessness within institutions, within family, within community, within the economy, within government. And so what his Durkheim's perspective a little bit was that idea that anomie is a constant feature in contemporary life. And you can see this, right? New technologies, social media, whatever it may be, is that life is constantly in this sense of being reorganized. And it's very destabilizing in one way. So it's paying attention to that. There's also this idea about social dysfunctions, that every system has dysfunctions. There's problems within every system. And sometimes, dysfunctions shed light on where the problems are and allows us to direct attention to those areas to be able to make change. The view of social change from a functionalist perspective is slow and gradual and working within the system. So for example, we talk about healthcare reform. We're not talking about something like universal healthcare or a public option is much more radical. A reform is much more fits with the functionalist viewpoint, is making small gradual change, working within the institutions themselves. And this is a lot different than the conflict theory viewpoint. Okay, so how does this relate to race, class, gender? Here's one application we can make. We can think about what are our common values regarding diversity. We live in a complex, diverse society. We are a nation of a lot of different histories, different membership to different groups, different religious organizations. So we have to hold us together as a nation, we have to have some common core values that we maintain and we support. We have various institutions that help teach us about those things. We also have challenges going on today too, right? With social media outlets that are not about promoting common values, but creating division and separation. Like that's a dysfunction. That's a problem for creating a more stable social order. It's also a reflection of some other things going on there too, maybe we can talk about later, but the idea from a functionalist viewpoint is that to build society and maintain a strong, healthy society, we have to have some core values that we're supporting. Equal protection under the law, and that's the 14th Amendment. And we have our constitutional rights, and we need to be guard dogs of what those constitutional rights and making sure that people's rights are being protected. A problem may come up with the issue of certain groups are threatened by the equal rights being actually protected. Because if equal rights aren't being protected, there may be some groups that gain from that. So the idea that Durkheim would have, or the functionalist viewpoint to have, is just for maintaining balance and order is important. How we sort of develop the sort of idea of a common identity, common values becomes important for providing some meaning and direction and a way for maintaining harmony in the larger social group. Where are dysfunctions? Dysfunctions are part of society itself. You can look at, Black Lives Matter as a response to inequities that are going on within the criminal justice system, within other areas of social life. And so this marching, this protesting or raising a voice is a very democratic right to be able to have a freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. Some groups were threatened by that and then pushing back, right? Pushing back against that. One of the limitations of functionalism is it does not address very well the issue of power. So I would argue that Black Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter movement is one about trying to ensure that democratic principles and ideas are being reinforced and being supported. When you get to the sort of things about, white supremacy and white nationalism, that's about protecting power. That's a group who feels threatened by this other sort of discussion about more of a more inclusive society, making sure people's rights are being protected. So functionalism doesn't address that very well. It's kind of a limitation of the theory. And that's why we have different theories. So conflict theory is a different perspective. Conflict theory offers this is Karl Marx, this picture here. Karl Marx has the idea of materialism and historical materialism. That's kind of an anchor for the conflict theory perspective. And historical materialism, basically in a nutshell, is that society, since humans emerged 200,000 years ago, and first we were basically hunters and gatherers, foragers. Then eventually that happened for the grand span of human history. And then we went from being nomadic, hunting and gathering, to settling into agricultural-based societies. So agriculture developed 10,000 years ago. We developed cities for the first time. Now, all of a sudden, social organization changed. The emergence of religion happens. So organized religion didn't exist before that. So Marxist, and so you go from agrarian society 10,000 years ago, then you go to industrialization, 1700s, post-industrialism, 1970s. And each of these different things are a part of the material structure. Material you could think about as economic structure. So every change in economic structure leads to changes in the experience of individuals, people, community, society, the way society is organized. Okay, so as an example, from a Marxist materialist perspective, crime is related to the economic structure. Industrial capitalism created the haves and have-nots in a different way than it did before. These systems come about because of the material structure. Slavery, a slave-based economy, is material structure. That slave-based economy creates institutions to reinforce that slave-based economy. So to bring about change from a Marxist viewpoint, to bring about change, you have to change the economic structure itself. You have to change the relationships of power. Whereas functionalism has this idea about, the consensus of values, Marxist perspective is that there's a coercion of values. People are being forced into it. And they may not even realize it, right? We may adopt certain practices, ways of thinking and knowing, and we accept them without even thinking about it. I'm reading a book right now. What I do with it, here's this book. It's a really interesting book about a person who grew up in Norway. She marries someone from the United States. She moves to the United States. She has a background in as a writer for Fortune magazine, The Atlantic, New York Times. She just basically is writing about sort of Nordic society, American society, and looking at different institutions. Americans have this sort of, some Americans are really fearful of universal health care. This idea that our healthcare is being provided by our employer, or it's for certain groups like with Medicare and Medicaid. A Marxist perspective is that we're being coerced into this, right? There are a lot of people who desire to have a more social support from the government to be able, to basically tax the wealthy at a rate that's much higher to be able to provide support for the majority of people within society. That's not, that's radical, right? That's a radical move from our American viewpoint. It doesn't make it socialist or communistic in any sort of stretch of the imagination, but rather that idea that we're so protective of the wealthy, and we have policies that are that protect the interests of the wealthy, and that takes, we get coerced into that. And that coercion is by force, and maybe not by military force, but by force of, cultural beliefs and dominant cultural beliefs and how we get socialized into that stuff. So that's kind of the conflict theory kind of viewpoint, kind of as a different vantage viewpoint about values and about institutions. Ultimately, the two perspectives, conflict theory is the more optimist perspective about humans. Conflict theory in a Marxist perspective is that humans are essentially good. It's the structure and of the social system that corrupts the social order and corrupts individuals. So we got to change the structure in order to create a more just society. So that's why Marxism or conflict theory is much more radical, because it says, the viewpoint is we have to change society itself. Things like stratification, the degree of inequality between different groups reflects power. It reflects the interest of, to maintain it reflects the interest of those in power, whether that's class, race, gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, or other areas of who we are. Another important concept is false consciousness and class consciousness. So false consciousness is the lack of awareness for why things are the way they are. Class consciousness is to become aware of how society is organized. For Marx, in the Communist Manifesto was basically a pamphlet to organize labor to bring about change. So say to try to awaken the working class, the proletariat, to become class conscious and to exert their influence and their voice to have a greater voice within society. To do that, we have to move away from false consciousness. So false consciousness, some ideas I would point to would be things like everybody in America has equal chance to be successful. Like that's false consciousness to me. That ignores the reality in which how society is organized in ways that provides privilege and disadvantage. That doesn't mean that we don't have influence over our lives or that we're totally controlled by the environment, but rather to say that the ideas and the values that we are taught in society are not actually accurate. And they're not accurate in ways that protect the interest of the ruling class. Like that's false consciousness. Like we believe the things that actually may be hurtful to our own economic interest. So ideology are basically beliefs. The dominant ideology or the dominant ideology in society is, from Marx's perspective, it's who writes the ideology, whose values are supported. It's the ideology of the ruling class. And then what that does, it leads to blaming the victims. We blame individuals who are poor for being poor. We blame, people who are, people who are identified as the problem. We blame them versus looking at the structure. And so that dominant ideology helps protect the interest of the ruling class. I'm not going to show this video right now. Maybe we'll watch it in class. But if you get a chance to watch it, it's basically about redlining, or how banks drew districts around particular areas back in the 1950s and 1960s into the 70s, and how that led to basically excluding African Americans and other races from buying property in certain areas in more white communities. And this impacted the development of wealth, the accumulation of wealth. And wealth is one way to pass on privilege to one's future generations. So these policies that got started created not only disparities in wealth acquisition, but also concentration of races in particular areas of community. And there's so many different aspects that are related to that. It's a cool short little video that gets at that. So conflict theory view, you could sort of think about a couple different things. To what extent are we defending our values of, our common values of diversity and inclusion and belonging and connection and equal protection? What are we taught about understanding inequalities? I think in America, we're taught, I think in large part to not address them. We're a nation of optimism, and that optimism sometimes can be make it very difficult to deal with the actual realities of things like inequality. Who teaches us about the various groups in society? Where do we learn this stuff, right? Where do we learn these different kinds of things? And both functionalism and conflict theory kind of go there. But for conflict theory, the idea would be, what are we learning in ways, what we are learning, the dominant values and ideas and narratives and stories are those that represent the ruling class interests. So we have to kind of work hard at becoming more conscious and more aware of the realities of the social world. And the only way to change the world is to be aware of it. How does change happen? It's through organization, through awareness. That's the kind of Marxist perspective. So this image here of a book, Vine Deloria, Custer Died for Your Sins, Native American scholar. I think he wrote this in the 1970s. I probably read it 20 years ago or so. And basically what he's writing history from Native American viewpoint. And the way he's writing, he's looking at policies that impacted Native Americans going back to westward expansion to 1960s, 70s, and policies that he's looking at through a lens of Native American, from his Native American vantage point. That vantage point is going to be significantly different than the vantage point of the dominant group. So there was policies that were established that, setting up boarding schools for Native Americans, and where Native Americans would be stripped of their Native identities and indoctrinated into Christian religious practices. That's a lot of value coercion, right? It's by force in this case. And Vine Deloria is writing about these policies from a different vantage point and perspective. And to me, it's like kind of illustrates this sort of conflict theory idea, is that we could be hearing the stories from the viewpoint of the oppressor versus the viewpoint of those who have been oppressed. And those two different viewpoints, I think understanding both those viewpoints are important to understanding kind of the system. A couple of different ideas, maybe conflict theory related. We could look at things like income gap between different households, right? So we have the upper class, middle class, and the lower class in terms of overall income and income growth from 1970, 2000 to 2018. And looking at basically that the upper's really grown in terms of overall income. So that inequality in America today is much more significant than it was back in the 1970s. We could look at race and ethnic group and wealth gaps between low-income families and different and low and middle income groups. And when we see this sort of chart right here, we see the lower income, right? So the sort of the ratio of median income, median net worth in a lower income family, about 10 times greater than from white to black in 2007, I mean. Then we sort of look at a course of time, is that median net worth change, it's different. I'm not explaining this very well. Hold on one second. Pause this for. All right, I had to gather my thoughts there for a second. Okay, so let's kind of go back to that. Okay, so basically trying to compare sort of middle income, lower income. What's the gap between whites and blacks, whites and Hispanics in terms of overall income? So lower income, middle income, what's the gap between whites and blacks and whites and Hispanic over time, 2017, 13, and 16. And what's kind of illustrating is that among the lower class, there's actually been kind of an evening out. There's still great disparity, right? So between whites and blacks, about 5 times the difference. That's about half of what it was back in 2007. There's different ways to look at this. One of them is it's becoming more, that gap's narrowed a little bit, so moving towards greater equity, but there's still inequality that's there, right? Raises the question a little bit, is that gap between whites and blacks kind of get closer? There could be one way of thinking about a white response to that, where whites may have felt like they were at least a higher status before. Now maybe in some sort of way, the environment today is that if lower class are more similar in terms of economic position, there may be more competition within those different groups. But the issue here that they're trying to also raise is that the middle class is that gap is actually kind of grown. So kind of like an issue of thinking about conflict theory is we're looking at inequities, we're looking at distribution of resources, whether those resources are income, wealth, housing, institutional responses, issues of justice in that regard. And then finally, our third theory is symbolic interactionism. So this is the micro level theory. And here the focus is on language and symbols, the meaning that we give things. So the Thomas theorem is if you define it as real, it's real in its consequences. So the idea is that our perceptions drive our behavior. How we think about gender inclusive bathrooms, like that, there's no one way of thinking about that. The way that we think about that influences how we decide to respond to transgender rights, to transgender bathrooms, to the experience of individuals who are transgender. There's a lot of culture in there, right? There's a lot of culture, a lot of history. There's a lot of meaning making that's going on. We think about civil rights movement. We think about any sort of movement, Black Lives Matter, like that is language, perceptions. There's the objective reality, but then there's the perception of reality itself. So there's a lot of stuff that symbolic interactionism is focused on getting to the issue of language, meaning, and understanding how we develop ways of thinking and knowing. Ibram Kendi, who writes a lot about sort of the African-American experience, the experience of people of color more generally. This is a powerful book called Stamped from the Beginning, looking at the ways in which society has the way in which dominant culture or society has created these inequities, how it's happened over a course of time. And there's a lot of stuff in there about, that really challenges the way that challenges the dominant cultural ways of thinking and knowing about race and inequality itself. Part of symbolic interactionism also gets us into identities. Every person has a racial identity. Whites have a racial identity, but that identity is different than somebody who's in not part of the majority group, because part of it is your social position shapes how you understand your particular identity. So that'd be another aspect of symbolic interactionism. You can watch this short video. I won't show it here. It's basically the Kenneth Clark study back in the 1950s that was important for Brown versus Board of Education, which ended segregation of public institutions, and what Kenneth Clark and Mamie Clark, both psychologists by trade, what they illustrated is that the meaning that was attached to the baby doll, a white baby doll versus a black baby doll, and how through culture and socialization is that people start to develop, young kids were developing kind of very harmful ideas about blacks' position in the world versus whites. I mean, the kids were learning stuff that made it very detrimental to their own self-development and impacted, they had a consequential and negative impact to them. Okay, so let's kind of talk, we're going to talk a little bit about this here and then spend more time in class talking about the matrix of domination. So basically the matrix of domination is this model, and this article that you're going to read is a complicated model or a complicated article. It's fairly abstract. It's fairly difficult to read. Work through it. If you can get 70% of it, 60% of it, rock on, great. Our goal is that we will, by talking about it and by working through the article, you will get it. But we're going to have to work through it together to get to that point. So I'll lay out some of the general ideas. I'm going to go through it pretty fast because I'd rather you spend time going through the article itself than me kind of recapturing everything in the article. So basically the idea is that Patricia Hill Collins offers is that there's different ways of knowing. There's the empirical way of knowing and the rational way of knowing. So rational way of knowing, critical thinking, is a rational way of knowing. Thinking from a viewpoint of others is a rational way of knowing. So being able to critically think and evaluate, understand from different vantage points is very important in terms of understanding. But sometimes, especially in the Western world, we privilege scientific empirical knowledge. And that's privileging of scientific knowledge, actually, what she argues is that privileging of that knowledge prevents us from understanding the lived realities of different groups in society, and that by not engaging in the critical thinking and critical evaluation part, we end up reinforcing inequality or maintaining the status quo. The idea of Patricia Hill Collins and the matrix model is that all systems of knowledge, all ways of thinking and knowing, there's some intersection with power. The dominant ideals in society, the dominant ways of thinking and knowing, they privilege the empirical, and they neglect the interpretive realm, the subjective realm. And that's purposeful and by design would be the idea. I mean, I'll give you an example why this makes a difference. So if I gave you statistics on the number of people in prison, I showed you a course of time, the empirical is important, right? We can establish trends. We can look at it across nations. But we also, what's going to be more motivating to understanding and what gives us a more complete understanding of the impact of the policies that generated, our current prison population. If we hear stories of individuals, stories of the individual or groups of individuals who have been impacted by these policies, understand how communities have been impacted. So maybe not only just the individuals who've been incarcerated, but how communities, from the viewpoint of people within the community itself, how they've been impacted by these policies. Like that information is meaningful. That information is humanizing. But that information also it can be very transformative because it can shake up the system, because we wouldn't have, it'd be harder to continue on in maintaining the current inequalities if we understood things from different groups' perspective. So part of this privileging the empirical and neglecting the interpretive or subjective is intentional. It reinforces the system kind of thing. She incorporates in her write-up on Matrix of Domination that, the Marxist statement that it's not that consciousness determines our social self or the ways of thinking, but it's our social being itself that determines our consciousness. So being aware that we are social beings, that we have control, we have influence, and we have the ability to engage in things in ways that to develop deeper ways of thinking and knowing. Matrix of Domination also kind of gets us into, specifically, Patricia Hill Collins was writing first about an African-American experience, the Black perspective, feminist perspective, and thinking about epistemology, ways of thinking and knowing is what epistemology is. So that thinking about different status positions, being Black, being a feminist, being female, that all these different things are different ways of different positions influence how a person sees the world and their experiences within the world. And it should be valued, right? So we should be able to look from different vantage points and perspectives and be able to understand and appreciate that we all have different experiences. Different groups have different experiences. The question is, how are those experiences different, and why? The goal is dialogue, not debate. The goal is to engage in dialogue. Let's help each other understand, right? And if we can do that in mutual self-regard, even groups, so oppositional to one another, to engage in dialogue is to engage in trying to understand. And if we engage in understanding, we actually can move the needle in a more powerful way. All knowledge contains values, even though it could be pretended that things like economics and economists, they're value free because they have these models that appear value free. There's values that are built into everything. And so rather than seeing things that are being value free, being able to understand how things are built upon value, understanding that and recognizing that. The question is that, with the Matrix of Domination is that it's not that epistemology or the subjective way of knowing should be weighted more than the empirical, but it should be recognized and viewed as sort of being a valuable way of knowing. It allows us to see the unique experiences of different groups as well as our common experiences. She also talks about in the article the importance for safe spaces, places for people of color to be, for students or for individuals who are marginalized in society, to be around individuals who have similar experiences. Those safe spaces are important. They're important for developing solidarity, meaning, perspective. And so she talks about this sort of idea about safe spaces. And so it's an important discussion. And then finally, intellectuals should be both empirical, they're trying to objectively understand, but also be focused on praxis. And praxis is theory and then action. Right? Data, science, and empirical stuff and theory is only important if you move it to action. That it has a model of social justice that's part of it. And then I guess just the last couple things, we could look at structural, it's paying attention to the influence of structure and culture on groups. So structure meaning things like the legal system, educational system, healthcare delivery system, structure of politics, economic structure. So it's looking at these sort of macro level, way out here, to community level, to interpersonal level, and looking at all that stuff and influence on the individual. It's also trying to contextualize things, to try to understand things in a historical context, looking at sort of the social, political context, and put things in that kind of perspective. White nationalism, why has white nationalism increased in recent years? How do we account for that? Trying to contextualize those kind of things is important. The Matrix of Domination moves away from this sort of difference model by focusing only on our difference, or sort of the additive model. The additive model treats things as being separate. So additive, that a person is female, person is lesbian, person is a person of color. We're just adding, right? A person with a disability, that we just keep on adding these different areas. And that's humans we don't work that way. Sure, we can have different layers of our experience and different layers of our identity, but we don't just add them up. So the matrix is about intersecting race, class, sexual orientation, different parts of our identities and our experiences, and be able to see that not only the relationship between dominant group and the subordinate group, but also the intersectionality between different aspects of our identities and our lived experience. She provides a critique too about, this of diversity focus, sometimes like diversity programs and diversity things, like an appreciation of diversity, is insufficient. In fact, it's kind of like a way to maintaining the system itself. That the focus on understanding intersectionality between different parts of our identity and the relationship between privilege and domination, like that's an analytical framework that's, this matrix of domination that's trying to transform society to be more equitable and more just. So to do that, we have to have, this theoretical framework provides a way of thinking that helps us to understand how things are the way that they are, okay? And then finally, there's 4 different elements to the matrix model. There's the structural, which are, you can just say, okay, let's just call it institutions. Maybe to keep it simple, it's a little bit more than that, but institutions, educational systems, healthcare systems. There's the disciplinary, which is the social control mechanisms. And the social control, oftentimes we think about law enforcement, we think about the criminal justice system. It could be within institutions themselves, like thinking about within employment, employers, and the kind of social control that happens within employment sectors. Then there's the interpretive realm, which includes representations, so images, the promotion of different ways of thinking and knowing. That's the interpretive. And then finally, the interpersonal, which is sort of our relationships, the ways that we develop ways of knowing. And right now, it's going to be like, oh man, there's 4 different areas. It's not going to make a lot of sense how they all relate to this overall model of the matrix of domination, but I guarantee you it will as we move forward. The basic for perspective is that you have this matrix of domination model, privilege, domination. There's different degrees of it that depends on, if we're talking about race, class, gender, whatever it may be. That distance between privilege and domination changes across context, time period, political, social environment. It's dynamic. That system of inequality is maintained in different ways. It's maintained by the structures of society itself. So institutions reinforce it. It's shaped by, so that our social control apparatus, institutions, help to reinforce inequality. The ways that we think and know about the social world help to maintain it. And then finally, through our interpersonal relationships, we are shaping and thinking about, our thoughts and responses, the way we think about inequality. So that's kind of it overall in a nutshell. Be safe, be well. I'll catch you in class. It's a review of the theories. Like I said, this article is a really difficult article to read. If you get 50% of it, rock on. We're going to come back. We're going to use it in class. So it'll make more sense the more we move forward. I encourage you also to read that Call Me article. It's a really good, easy access article on the theoretical perspectives. All right, sounds good. Enjoy your day. See you later on the week.